At his wife's funeral, the millionaire paraded his mistress like a prize. But when the lawyer played a video the widow recorded before dying, everything changed. A new will, legal proof she built his empire, and one final message that left the room speechless. Now let's see what you do without me. The air was thick with perfume and pretense. Under the vaulted ceilings of St. Albans Chapel, guests sat stiffly in rows, their black coats tailored and expensive, their faces polished with sympathy that didn't quite reach their eyes. The flower arrangements were extravagant, towering white lilies and blood-red roses meticulously sculpted into silent mourning. At the front of the chapel, the casket gleamed in soft candlelight, mahogany with gold handles, as cold and unyielding as the man who now stood beside it. Julian Hartley adjusted the cuff of his designer suit and let his eyes scan the room. His expression was somber, but detached, like a man attending a meeting he couldn't wait to finish. Standing beside him was the reason whispers had begun even before the service started. Delilah, 26, stunning, and criminally underdressed in a sleek black dress that clung to her like it had been sewn onto her body that very morning, clutched Julian's arm with a red lacquered hand. She didn't cry. She didn't bow her head. She looked at the casket as if it were the final page in a chapter she'd skimmed out of boredom. Julian didn't see the disapproval etched into the faces of his late wife's family. Or if he did, he didn't care. This wasn't a moment of grief for him. It was a new beginning. He had spent the last year telling anyone who'd listened that Charlotte had been sick for a long time, that they had grown apart, that he had tried everything. But behind closed doors, there had been no warmth, no effort, no love. Charlotte had withered in silence while he paraded his power across boardrooms and bedrooms alike. He took his seat in the front pew, Delilah settling beside him. Her perfume was sweet, almost sickening in the enclosed space. Julian didn't flinch when the priest began to speak. He didn't blink when Charlotte's sister stepped up to the podium, her voice trembling as she recalled a childhood filled with laughter, a marriage built on ambition, and a woman who, even in her final months, never said a bitter word about the man now gripping another woman's hand. Julian sat motionless, one leg crossed over the other, fingers tapping rhythmically against his thigh. He wasn't here to mourn. He was here to make a statement. I've moved on. When the ceremony reached its midpoint, the hush that blanketed the room grew heavier. The priest bowed his head. Before we close this service, there is one final request from the deceased, he said gently. Charlotte recorded a message to be played today. She asked that it be shared now. Julian's fingers froze mid-tap. The murmurs started before the lights even dimmed. Somewhere in the pews, a breath caught. A cousin stiffened. Delilah leaned forward, the amusement gone from her face. A screen descended slowly behind the altar. Julian turned to the lawyer seated 2 rows behind him. Mr. Langford, an old man with a twitch in his left eye and a spine stiff with formality. Langford gave a nod and rose, walking to the side of the podium where a small laptop had been discreetly placed. He connected a cable. The screen came to life. At first, only silence. Then, the image of Charlotte appeared. Pale, composed, wrapped in a soft gray sweater, seated in a chair with sunlight dancing across her thinning hair. Her eyes, once warm, now carried a steeliness that seemed to pierce through the room. "Hello," she said, her voice calm, clear. "If you're watching this, it means I'm no longer here. And if I know my husband, he's already moved on." There were gasps. Delilah straightened in her seat. Julian's face remained expressionless, but a vein pulsed at his temple. Charlotte continued, "I thought long and hard about whether I wanted to leave anything behind. I considered silence. But then I remembered how much truth can matter, even if it arrives late." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Julian, I gave you everything. My love, my time, my loyalty. I stood beside you when you had nothing but an idea and a borrowed suit. I watched you build an empire, brick by brick, and never once asked for credit. And still, you made me invisible." In the pews, jaws clenched. The board members who had attended out of obligation now sat upright, alert. Charlotte's voice softened, almost sad. "You probably think everything you own is yours, that you built it with your brilliance and charm. But let me remind you of something. In 2003, when you needed startup capital, who sold her grandmother's estate to fund your dream? When the market crashed in 2008 and you almost lost everything, who took out a second mortgage without telling anyone to keep the business afloat. I was there. Always. Quietly. Unquestionably. But I made one final decision without you. Julian's face changed. He tried to hide it, but the flicker of uncertainty passed across his features like a shadow. He shifted in his seat, then leaned forward, as if getting closer would change the outcome. Charlotte looked directly into the camera now. A few months before I died, I rewrote my will. You don't know this, but I spoke to my lawyer, changed the terms, and transferred every asset I had a claim to, because they were mine first. You will find, when you return home, that control is no longer something you can claim by default. The room was frozen. Not even the priest moved. I've left a detailed account with Mr. Langford, Charlotte continued, and you'll find that many of your favorite luxuries, the penthouse, the summer home, even your office building, have been reallocated. You may still have your name on the sign, but that's all it is now. A name. She leaned back slightly, her face softening for the first time. To those who stood by me, thank you. To those who pitied me, don't. I didn't stay because I was weak. I stayed to watch. And now, I leave you with this final thought. She paused, her eyes glittering. Now let's see what you do without me. The screen went black. Silence shattered into murmurs. Delilah stood abruptly, her heels clicking as she turned and walked down the aisle without a word. Some guests followed, others stayed, stunned into immobility. Mr. Langford returned to his seat, not even bothering to look Julian's way. The once proud millionaire sat alone now, his shoulders drawn, his mouth dry, his pulse racing beneath expensive fabric. It wasn't grief that filled him. It wasn't guilt. It was the hollow realization that everything he had, every piece of power he wielded, had died with the woman he thought was disposable. He didn't move when the priest announced the closing hymn. He didn't flinch when the casket began its slow descent into the marble tomb. And he didn't follow the crowd outside when the service ended. He sat in that front pew, still and silent, while the world shifted around him. Without his consent, without his control, without her. What would you do if someone revealed a secret like that at a funeral? Drop your answer in the comments. I'd love to see how you'd react in Julian's place. And while you're at it, give this story a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and rate it from 0 to 10 so far. Every like, comment, and tip helps keep stories like this coming. Thank you for being part of it. The rain had started as a whisper, soft droplets tapping gently against the chapel's arched windows, before turning into a slow, steady rhythm that drummed down like the heartbeat of the city itself. The pallbearers stood at the ready, solemn and still, their white gloves gripping the brass handles of the casket as if the world might fall apart if they let go. The final prayer had been spoken, the hymn sung in quiet, broken voices, and now the crowd began to stir. But no one moved toward the doors just yet. Something held them in place. Something unspoken, hovering in the heavy air like a final breath waiting to be exhaled. Julian Hartley had not moved from his seat since the video ended. His posture was too rigid to be natural, too still to be comfortable, as if he had been turned to stone by the force of his late wife's last act. Delilah had vanished minutes earlier, the clicking of her heels now only a memory. She hadn't said a word, hadn't even looked back. A few guests whispered her name, surprised she'd come at all, more surprised she'd walked out with such haste, but no one dared speak louder than a murmur. No one wanted to draw Julian's attention. Not now. The silence was broken by the scraping of a wooden pew. An older woman, Charlotte's aunt, perhaps, or maybe a family friend from her book club, rose to her feet with effort and made her way to the casket. She placed a single white rose on top and whispered something inaudible. Others soon followed, one by one, lining up in slow procession to say their goodbyes. There were no grand declarations of grief, no dramatic wails or sobbing fits. Only reverence, only quiet heartbreak, only the devastating absence of a woman who, until now, had never truly taken center stage in her own story. As the line of mourners moved forward, Julian remained seated, his eyes fixed not on the casket, but on the floor tiles beneath his polished shoes. His thoughts were not with Charlotte's rosewood coffin, nor with the guests casting judgment with their sideway glances. They were tangled in confusion, disbelief, and something dangerously close to fear. He had been blindsided, humiliated in front of peers and competitors alike. The words in Charlotte's video echoed in his mind on an endless loop. you'll find that control is no longer something you can claim by default. That line had lodged itself deep in his chest like a shard of glass. Every breath scraped against it. The lawyer, Mr. Langford, approached him quietly. He didn't sit, didn't speak loudly, merely leaned slightly forward so only Julian could hear. There will be documents delivered to your office in the morning. I'd suggest reviewing them promptly. His voice was calm, almost pitiful. We can schedule a meeting later in the week. Perhaps Wednesday. Julian didn't respond. His lips parted slightly, as if to speak, but no sound came out. Mr. Langford straightened, gave a tight nod, and walked away, merging into the sea of black suits and gloved hands. The last mourner approached the casket, a young girl no older than 7. She clutched a small bouquet of daisies and stood on her tiptoes to place them on the lower edge of the casket. Her mother knelt beside her, whispering something into her ear, and the girl nodded solemnly before walking back toward the pews. Even in youth, she understood the weight of this moment. Grief didn't spare the innocent. It merely arrived without warning and left its fingerprints on every surface. At last, the chapel doors creaked open. The pallbearers lifted the casket with slow, reverent strength, and the organ began to play again. Soft, mournful chords that resonated deep within the wooden pews and the bones of every person in the room. The funeral procession moved forward, inch by inch, step by step. Charlotte was leaving the chapel for the final time, her legacy trailing behind her in stunned silence. Julian stood only when it was impossible not to. His movements were slow, almost robotic, and his expression unreadable. The crowd parted naturally as he approached the casket, allowing him space, though no one offered a comforting hand. No one said his name. They simply watched, judging, waiting. As he passed by them, he could feel the weight of their eyes pressing down on him, not in sympathy, but in quiet condemnation. This wasn't the admiration he was used to. This wasn't the power he had grown addicted to. This was exile. He stepped outside into the rain, blinking against the gray light of the sky. His chauffeur stood waiting beside the sleek black car, the door already open. But Julian didn't get in. Instead, he stood at the edge of the chapel steps, watching as Charlotte's casket was loaded into the hearse. The rain soaked into the shoulders of his suit, but he didn't seem to notice. He just stood there, drenched and stunned, trying to make sense of how quickly the world had shifted beneath his feet. Charlotte's sister approached him quietly. Her name was Helen, and they hadn't spoken in nearly 2 years. Not since a charity dinner where Charlotte had sat silent most of the night, her eyes heavy, her smile faint. Helen's voice was firm, cold as the rain. She asked me to give you this. She handed him a folded note. Said you'd probably ignore it. But I promised. Julian took the note without a word, fingers trembling slightly. Helen didn't wait for a reply. She turned and walked toward her waiting car, umbrella in hand, expression unreadable. He opened the note slowly, shielding it from the rain. It was handwritten, short, and in Charlotte's familiar, looping script. You always said funerals were for the living. So I gave you something to live with. Goodbye. He read the words 3 times before folding the paper and sliding it into his inner pocket, close to his chest. A strange laugh, soft and bitter, escaped his lips. She had known exactly what she was doing. Even in death, she had orchestrated the scene with precision. Even in death, she was one step ahead. The rest of the day passed in a blur. The burial was brief, attended only by close family. Julian did not stay for the lowering of the casket. He couldn't. Not because of grief, but because of pride. Because he couldn't bear to see the physical representation of his defeat lowered into the earth while whispers swirled around him like vultures. Back at the penthouse, the silence was deafening. The rain continued outside, tapping against the floor-to-ceiling windows with a rhythm that felt mocking. The space, once opulent and full of life, now felt cavernous and cold. Delilah's absence hung in the air like smoke after a fire, sharp, acrid, undeniable. He had tried to call her, once, maybe twice, but the calls went unanswered. Her voicemail was blank. Her things were gone. He stood in the center of the living room, unsure of what to do. The empire he'd built, the image he had cultivated, the life he believed was invincible. All of it suddenly felt like a house of cards. Charlotte had been the foundation he hadn't acknowledged. Now, with one final act, she had removed herself from the equation, and everything was starting to collapse. As night settled over the city, Julian found himself seated at the dining table, the same place where Charlotte once sat quietly beside him, sipping wine and asking about his day. He could almost hear her voice, calm and steady, asking questions he had never bothered to answer. She had always been patient, always watching, and now she had finally spoken. He picked up his glass, but there was no wine to drink, no toast to make, only silence, and a bitter, hollow feeling growing inside him. And this was just the beginning. The next morning, the city woke with its usual rhythm, horns blaring, elevators humming, espresso machines sputtering to life in the corner cafes. But inside the Hartley penthouse, time had stopped. Julian sat alone in his study, surrounded by shelves of leather-bound books he had never read and mahogany furniture that gleamed with lifeless polish. The morning light filtered through the windows in fractured beams, illuminating the dust in the air like a gentle snowfall. He hadn't slept. His tie was still knotted at his throat from the day before, though his jacket lay discarded on the floor like the armor of a man who had finally admitted defeat. The silence in the room was oppressive, broken only by the occasional hum of the air conditioning and the distant honk of a taxi below. The television remained off. His phone vibrated once, twice, then again, messages from colleagues, friends, people who had attended the funeral and didn't know what to say, but felt compelled to say something anyway. He didn't answer them. He scrolled, read, and deleted each one without a second thought. Nothing anyone could write mattered, because Charlotte had already spoken, and her voice, pre-recorded, posthumous, pointed, was louder than any of theirs. The moment replayed itself in his mind like a haunting reel, the scream descending behind the altar, the hush that fell over the chapel, and then her face, so serene, so composed, so knowing. She hadn't flinched. She hadn't begged for understanding or tried to stir guilt. She had simply laid the facts bare, wrapped in dignity and razor-sharp resolve. And she had done it in front of everyone. There was no undoing it. No spinning the story. No damage control. Her voice had stripped him down, exposing the reality beneath the luxury. That he hadn't built his empire alone, and that his greatest asset had always been the woman he dismissed too easily. Julian stood and walked slowly toward the small safe tucked behind a painting in the far corner of the room. He keyed in the code with trembling fingers, her birthday, and opened it to retrieve a thick envelope stamped with the firm's seal. Inside were the estate documents Mr. Langford had delivered hours earlier, as promised. Julian pulled them out, sat back at his desk, and began to read. The first few pages were straightforward: Charlotte's death certificate, funeral arrangements, notarized confirmations. Then came the revised will. His name appeared, but only briefly. Her assets, once considered joint, had been meticulously reassigned. The primary beneficiary was a trust in her name, administered by a board of trustees she had personally selected, including a former business professor, a close friend from law school, and a woman he vaguely remembered as Charlotte's college roommate. There was a note attached: to ensure the future is guided by vision, not vanity. The penthouse was gone, legally reassigned. He would be permitted to stay for 60 days under grace, after which the property would be liquidated or transferred to the trust's ownership. The summer home in the Hamptons? Gone. The private art collection? Gone. Even the antique piano that Charlotte had once played every Sunday morning, her fingers coaxing melodies that drifted through the apartment like silk, that, too, had been donated to a conservatory. Julian's breath hitched as he realized she had left nothing to chance. She had thought this through to the finest detail. Every asset he had come to associate with power, control, prestige. She had taken it all, not with malice, but with precision. And he had never even seen it coming. He turned to the final page, where her signature rested neatly at the bottom. Next to it was a handwritten message in the margin: your name is still on the door, but names can be replaced. Julian stared at those words for a long time. He could feel something unraveling inside him, slow and quiet like a thread being pulled from the seam of a once flawless suit. He wanted to scream, to throw the papers, to punch something, to erase the feeling crawling up his throat. But he didn't. He couldn't, because it wasn't anger filling his chest. It was shame, cold, unfamiliar, and utterly disarming. The rest of the day passed in a haze. He paced the apartment like a caged animal, every room echoing with memories he'd long ignored. Charlotte laughing from the kitchen as she burned toast on purpose just to prove she could cook as badly as he could. Charlotte curled on the couch in her oversized sweaters, glasses sliding down her nose as she annotated books no one else cared about. Charlotte at the piano, sunlight in her hair, eyes closed, playing music just for herself. And now, Charlotte in that video, watching him from beyond the veil with calm clarity, dismantling the illusion he had spent years constructing. That evening, the doorbell rang. Julian opened it to find Thomas Green, his COO and longest-serving business partner, standing in the hallway with an envelope in hand and an unreadable expression. "I thought we should talk," Thomas said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. He didn't sit. He simply held out the envelope. "This came through corporate counsel this morning." Julian took it and opened it with mechanical detachment. Inside was a formal notice from the board. A review was being scheduled. His position as CEO would be under evaluation pending recent disclosures. They were polite, professional, cold. "They're nervous," Thomas said quietly. "Some of the investors saw the funeral clip. It's been circulating online. Clients are asking questions. About the trust. About Charlotte's involvement. About everything." Julian swallowed hard. "They think I was lying. They think you built a facade," Thomas replied. "And they're wondering what else might be hidden behind it." For a long moment, neither man spoke. Then Julian nodded once, more to himself than to Thomas. "Thanks for telling me in person." Thomas hesitated. "For what it's worth, I think you underestimated her." "We all did." Julian watched as Thomas left, the door closing with a soft click behind him. He turned back to the papers in his hand and realized that this was no longer a private humiliation. Charlotte hadn't just rewritten the will. She'd rewritten the narrative. And now, the world was watching. He poured himself a drink, scotch, neat, and sank into the couch, letting the liquid burn its way down. The city lights sparkled beyond the glass, cold and distant. He looked at the empty space beside him, where Delilah used to sit, legs crossed, always scrolling through her phone. That seat was empty now. She hadn't come back. No messages. No apologies. Just a disappearance so swift it barely left a trace. And Charlotte was everywhere. In the will, in the whispers, in the echo of her voice. He opened his laptop, hesitated, and finally pressed play on the saved video file. Her face appeared again, frozen in time. And as her voice filled the room for the second time, Julian felt the floor beneath his empire begin to shift. Because her voice hadn't just lived on. It had taken everything with it. The following days unfolded like a slow-motion unraveling of everything Julian hardly thought he controlled. With each passing hour, another thread came loose. Emails unanswered, contracts delayed, meetings postponed. His assistants whispered behind closed doors now, their greetings suddenly clipped and cautious. Even the doorman downstairs no longer flashed his usual obsequious smile. There was a shift in the air, subtle but unmistakable, as if the city itself had caught wind of his downfall and was waiting to see whether he'd stumble or shatter. Yet despite the unraveling, Julian couldn't bring himself to act. Not yet, because he needed answers first. And those answers were buried not in the future, but in the past. He spent hours each night combing through old files, business records, partnership agreements, joint account statements. For the first time in years, he paid attention to the fine print. And there, tucked away in line items he'd once dismissed as background noise, he began to see it, Charlotte's presence. Not just as a supportive wife, but as a silent architect. She wasn't listed on company letterheads or featured in interviews, but her fingerprints were everywhere. In the early investor pitches she had edited late at night. In the anonymous wire transfers that covered rent when the office couldn't make payroll. In the silent sacrifices, the stocks she sold without telling him, the inheritance she surrendered, to keep the engine running while he basked in the illusion of self-made success. Julian had built the stage, but it was Charlotte who had held the lights steady, fixed the wiring, and paid the electric bill when the crowd wasn't watching. He found an old folder deep in his archives, one of those thick leather-bound binders from his startup days, now dusty and cracked at the edges. Inside, handwritten notes in Charlotte's script lined the margins. Her comments were precise, her edits sharper than his own thoughts had been. She had reviewed his earliest drafts of the company charter, not just as a supportive partner, but as someone who saw the holes before they could become liabilities. There was a sticky note pressed against the back page. Don't overpromise, just deliver. That had become the company's tagline 2 years later. He'd forgotten where it came from. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling as a hollow laugh escaped his lips. How many times had he stood in front of cameras, crediting his own vision, calling himself a maverick? How many board meetings had he walked into, puffed with pride, while Charlotte sat quietly at charity luncheons and galas, treated like an accessory rather than a partner? It wasn't just guilt that clawed at him now. It was the bitter taste of realization. He hadn't just lost her. He had never truly seen her to begin with. His phone buzzed on the desk. A message from Greg Talbot, the head of investor relations. We need to talk. Urgently. Julian didn't respond. Instead, he stood and walked to the window, looking out over the cityscape that used to ignite ambition in his chest. Now, it looked like a map of errors, a monument to blindness. He had spent decades chasing skyline views and luxury, thinking power was measured in square footage and brand names. But Charlotte had understood something deeper. She'd worked in silence, played the long game, and then, with one final move, reminded him that power without respect was nothing but illusion. Later that afternoon, he finally picked up the phone and called Mr. Langford. I need clarity, Julian said without preamble. On everything. The lawyer's voice was as calm as ever. Clarity is rarely painless, Mr. Hartley, but I'll walk you through it. They met in the law firm's downtown office, sleek, impersonal, flooded with natural light. Julian arrived early but still found Langford already waiting, a thick folder open in front of him. For the next hour, the lawyer walked Julian through the revised trust structure, explaining how Charlotte had begun shifting her assets well over a year before her death. There had been no deception, just strategy. Every move had been legal, calculated, and above reproach. She spoke to me months before she got the diagnosis, Langford explained, adjusting his glasses. She knew something was off, but she didn't say it directly, just that she needed to prepare for an eventuality. At first, I assumed she was being cautious. Later, I understood she was being deliberate. Julian listened, absorbing every word like a blow. Charlotte hadn't acted out of impulse or bitterness. This had been her plan all along. Not to hurt him, but to finally reclaim the credit, the space, the respect she had long been denied. She set up a foundation, Langford added, in her name. It's not just about taking assets away from you. It's about redirecting them. Supporting small businesses, particularly women-led startups. You might say, she's funding the next generation of people like you. Except this time, she wants them to know who helped them. Julian looked down at his hands, once so steady in negotiation, now trembling at the edges. He had always assumed he was the puppet master, that everyone around him was there to serve a purpose, investors to please, employees to command, wives to display. But Charlotte had been playing a deeper game. She had seen his ambition and chosen, not to fight it, but to feed it, until she could turn it into something else entirely. That night, he walked the streets for hours without a destination, just his footsteps, echoing through corridors of thought he'd never bothered to explore. He remembered a dinner party years ago, when a guest had praised Julian's work ethic. Charlotte had smiled, quiet and proud. Later that night, she had said, "Success is shared. You don't carry the whole thing on your own." He had laughed then, dismissing it as modesty. Now, he saw it for what it was, a truth she had accepted long before he was ready to hear it. By the time he returned to the penthouse, the city had quieted. He stepped into the living room, the lights dim, the space echoing with a strange emptiness. On the coffee table, an unopened envelope sat waiting. Langford must have sent it by courier. Inside was a single-page letter in Charlotte's handwriting. No instructions, no bitterness, just one final line. You always wanted to be the face of the empire. I was content being the foundation. Let's see what survives when the surface cracks. Julian folded the letter carefully and slid it into the breast pocket of his shirt. He didn't cry. Not yet. But something inside him began to shift, slow and irreversible. The kind of shift that doesn't show on the surface at first. The kind that takes root in silence. She had built the empire with him, and in the end, she had dismantled it with grace. Not with revenge, but with clarity. And now he had to live in the house she designed, with no doors left to close and no mirrors left to avoid. Julian stared at the ceiling that night, not for the first time, but with a heaviness in his chest that hadn't been there before. The city lights no longer soothed him. The hum of the penthouse, once a comfort, now felt like an echo chamber where Charlotte's voice still lingered. He had always taken her silence for submission, her patience for passivity, but now he understood that Charlotte had never been absent. She had merely been watching, listening, planning. She had learned to read him like a script, predicting the ending long before he even knew there was a story unfolding. And now she had flipped the last page, closed the book, and left him standing there, halfway through a sentence, speechless. He hadn't returned to the office in days. His team had stopped calling. There were rumors of an interim board vote, though no one had the courage to tell him directly. He could feel it anyway, in the silence of his inbox, in the cautious distance of those who once bowed at his every word. They didn't want his name anymore. They wanted stability. Charlotte's video hadn't just shaken his image, it had rewritten it entirely. And as if that wasn't enough, Langford had sent a second envelope, smaller, more personal. Inside, a revised copy of Charlotte's handwritten will, separate from the legal version he had already reviewed. It wasn't necessary, Langford had said. Everything was already binding. But Charlotte had wanted him to see it, to read it in her words. The letter began simply, "To Julian, because you'll always need the last word, and this time, I've earned it." He had scoffed at that, but the smirk had faded by the second line. "I knew you'd try to outlive me in more ways than one. That's what this has always been, hasn't it? A race, a climb, a game of leverage and optics. And I played along. I smiled for the cameras. I played the wife in the wings. But I kept the receipts. All of them." Julian's fingers trembled as he turned the page. The next section listed the assets she had quietly protected, investments he never knew she made, accounts she managed behind the scenes. She had pulled her name off joint properties one by one, strategically and legally, without ever alerting him. It hadn't been out of spite. It had been survival. Control, she wrote, was not always about power. Sometimes it was about options. And she had preserved hers in silence. The last section of the will, though, held the real twist. She hadn't left everything to a foundation or an anonymous trust. She had made personal choices, thoughtful ones, with names. The penthouse would go to Julian, temporarily, only until the estate found permanent housing for a woman named Lila, a single mother who had worked as Charlotte's caregiver in her final months. Julian blinked at the name. He barely remembered her. A soft-spoken woman who had moved like a shadow through the hallways. Apparently, Charlotte had seen more in her than he had. Once relocated, the trust would sell the property and use the proceeds to establish a transitional housing program in Lila's name. The summer home was already in the process of being donated to a nonprofit for children recovering from medical trauma. The art collection had been transferred to a rotating museum exhibit titled The Quiet Partners, featuring the works and contributions of spouses, mostly women, who had supported great men from behind the curtain. Julian's own name appeared only once, on the final page. "To my husband, who taught me the difference between being loved and being used. I leave you what you already claimed, your name, your suits, your legacy of self-importance. I hope, with all honesty, you find something more meaningful than that before your time ends too. Not for my sake, for yours." He folded the pages with care, not out of sentiment, but because his hands had begun to shake too much to keep holding them. He placed the letter back into its envelope and set it on the desk, beside a photo of them taken nearly 15 years ago. He barely recognized himself in it. Younger, yes, but also sharper, colder. Charlotte had her arm hooked around his, eyes turned toward him with a look that was part awe, part concern. He remembered that night. They had just landed their first big investor. He thought she was proud. Now he wondered if she had been quietly bracing herself even then. He didn't drink that night. He couldn't. The thought of numbing the ache felt like an insult to her memory. Instead, he sat with it, let it press into his ribs and settle beneath his skin. Let the reality soak through him slowly like rain in concrete. Unavoidable, unrelenting, transformative. The next morning, he woke to find that Delilah had returned, not to reconcile, but to collect the last of her things. She didn't knock. She entered with a key Charlotte had once made for her, back when she was a friend from the gallery, and not yet the woman sitting next to Julian at board dinners. "I won't be long," she said simply, eyes scanning the room without meeting his. Julian stood in the kitchen, coffee in hand, unsure what to say. Her presence no longer stirred desire or anger, just fatigue. He realized he didn't know her, had never tried to. She was beautiful, yes, young, vibrant, eager to please. But Charlotte had known. Even before she said it, she had seen through Delilah the way she had seen through him. "Did you know?" he asked, voice rough with sleep. Delilah paused. "About the will?" "No." "About her?" "Yes." She gathered her things without a word, packed neatly, methodically. She moved like a guest, not with guilt, but with detachment. She left the key on the marble counter and turned once before walking out. For what it's worth, I think she won. The door clicked shut, and Julian was alone again. Later that day, he received an invitation and signed, sent via registered mail. A small, private ceremony in the garden of the Children's Hospital Charlotte had supported anonymously for years. The invitation was printed on cream cardstock, embossed with gold lettering, simple and elegant. There was no RSVP, just a time and an address. Julian almost didn't go, but something pulled him there. He arrived in a black sedan, no entourage, no fanfare. The garden was modest. Lavender bushes lined the path. A bench bore a small gold plaque, in honor of those who carry without recognition. Children's laughter floated from the nearby wing. At the center of the garden, a woman in a blue blazer approached him. She introduced herself as the director of the foundation, said Charlotte had given them everything, plans, funding, a vision, that she had spent hours here, long after her treatments, asking what the hospital needed, not what it could do for her name. She said legacies are only real if they're useful, the woman said, and that yours would come around when it was ready. Julian nodded, words caught in his throat. Before he left, she handed him a small velvet box. Inside was Charlotte's wedding ring. Simple, timeless. He hadn't realized she'd stopped wearing it until it wasn't on her finger in the video. "She left this behind," the woman said. "Said you might understand its value eventually." Julian held the ring in his palm and stared at it until the garden around him blurred. He didn't cry then, either. But the ache in his chest told him that something real, something sharp and honest, had finally broken free. And it wasn't rage. It was the sound of his pride, finally letting go. The building buzzed with a kind of polite unease when Julian stepped into the lobby of his headquarters. The security guard offered a stiff nod, not quite meeting his eyes. The receptionist, who once chirped good mornings with bright eyes and perfect teeth, barely looked up from her screen. It was subtle, the way people moved around him now, no longer stopping to chat, no longer eager to bask in his approval. If power had once clung to him like a tailored suit, now it was peeling off at the seams, shedding thread by thread with every step he took across the marble floor. The elevator ride to the top floor was unusually quiet. He used to relish those brief moments of ascent, staring at his reflection in the mirrored walls, rehearsing his confidence. But today he avoided his own gaze. His reflection looked older, hollowed, like someone who had aged years in the space of a single week. The gray at his temples seemed more pronounced, his jawline less defined, and there was something unfamiliar in his eyes, something that looked dangerously close to regret. The executive floor was half empty. A few assistants murmured near the corner office. His own team wasn't there. No one rushed to brief him or hand him a coffee or prep him for meetings. It was a ghost town in a building that used to hum with energy, and it confirmed what he already suspected. His grip was slipping, and everyone else had noticed it long before he had. Thomas was waiting for him in the boardroom, seated at the far end of the long glass table. Several of the board members were already there, some avoiding his gaze, others watching him with a mixture of curiosity and calculation. These were people who had praised him for decades, who toasted his leadership at holiday parties and repeated his catchphrases at conferences. But today, their smiles were brittle, their eyes sharp, and he could feel that whatever happened next, no one would be standing to applaud. "Julian," Thomas said, rising as a courtesy. "Thanks for coming in." Julian gave a stiff nod and took the empty seat at the center, the one he used to command with effortless authority. He folded his hands in front of him and waited. No jokes, no greetings, just silence stretching into discomfort. "We've reviewed the footage from the funeral," one board member finally said, his voice steady but lacking warmth. It's gone viral. There's media pressure, investor inquiries. and considerable concern about the stability of the leadership structure moving forward. Another chimed in, a woman with sharp glasses and a voice that never wavered. It's not just the optics, Julian. It's what the video implies. That your narrative about this company, your origin story, was never entirely true. And if that's in question, what else is? He wanted to speak, to defend himself, to explain that Charlotte had never wanted the spotlight, that she had supported him willingly. But the words felt stale even before they reached his lips. He remembered the way she had looked into the camera, calm and unapologetic, and realized that her story had become stronger than his. Not louder, just truer. She didn't do it to destroy the company, he finally said. She believed in what we built, but she wanted to make sure people knew the full picture. And now they do, Thomas added softly. The question is, where do we go from here? There was no shouting, no accusations, just the cold, professional tone of people making decisions that would change everything. He had built this board, selected every member, trained them to reflect his values. But now, they were peeling away from him, one by one, like leaves in autumn, and he didn't have the strength to chase them. When the meeting ended, there was no applause, no handshake, just silence as Julian stood, nodded, and walked out of the room that once bent to his will. Back in his office, he sat at his desk, hands resting on the polished surface like a man who had returned to a home he no longer recognized. Everything was where it had always been. The awards, the framed newspaper articles, the custom desk chair, but it all felt distant, performative, like props on a stage long since abandoned. He opened the drawer and pulled out a photo of Charlotte. It was from a gala nearly a decade ago. She was in a navy dress, her hair in soft waves, her smile genuine but subdued. He remembered that night. She had spent most of it talking to the waitstaff, asking about their families, their goals. At the time, he had teased her about it. You're not running for office, Char. She had shrugged, just trying to remember that people matter more than spotlights. He hadn't understood her then. He barely understood her now. But he felt her everywhere, in the quiet way his name no longer carried weight, in the questions his partners now dared to ask, in the steadiness of her posthumous revenge. Except it hadn't been revenge. Not exactly. It was a correction, and he was only beginning to feel its effects. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. It was Lily, the new legal advisor for the estate trust. Young, meticulous, and clearly uncomfortable to be there. She stepped inside with a folder in her hands and a hesitant expression. I didn't want to do this over email, she said, offering the folder. It's the finalized timeline for the asset transitions, including the penthouse. You'll have until the end of next month to vacate. Julian took the folder, nodded. She lingered for a moment, then added, there's also a scheduled interview with Forbes. They're doing a piece on Charlotte's philanthropic legacy. I thought you should know. He let out a soft laugh, empty and bitter. Of course they are. Lily paused at the door. Mr. Hartley, I wasn't here for the history, but from everything I've read, she wasn't trying to humiliate you. She just didn't want to be forgotten. He didn't answer. She left without waiting for one. That evening, he sat by the window of the penthouse, the skyline laid out before him in glittering indifference. He poured himself a drink, but didn't touch it. The silence was different now. Not oppressive, not cruel, just real. Honest in a way he hadn't known how to be. He was starting to understand what Charlotte had meant by legacy. That it wasn't about buildings or brands or boardrooms. It was about what survived you. And he was starting to see that all the applause, all the accolades, had never been real. Not without her. He took the wedding ring from the velvet box and turned it over in his hand. It was small, unassuming, but it carried weight. Not of gold, but of memory. Of moments missed and truths ignored. And now, as the last echoes of applause faded from the corridors of his empire, he sat alone, watching the city, and finally heard what Charlotte had been trying to tell him all along. Some legacies whisper, but theirs had shouted long after she was gone. And the room, once full of admiration, had fallen silent in her honor. Not his. Julian Hartley woke up before the sun. Not because of any schedule or responsibility. Those had mostly evaporated, but because sleep no longer held him the way it used to. His dreams had turned restless, filled with flickering images of Charlotte's face, her voice looping over and over in that last line she had left for him. Now let's see what you do without me. Each time he closed his eyes, her words echoed louder, not cruelly, but as a challenge, a haunting whisper pushing him to confront the life he had crafted on a foundation he never truly understood. The penthouse was quiet, still grand in appearance, but hollow. The plants had begun to wilt. The marble countertops reflected the soft light of morning, but there was no warmth in the space anymore, only an echo of someone who used to fill it without needing to speak much at all. The news cycle had not been kind. Charlotte's funeral video had leaked online in full, and in less than 24 hours, it had spread across social media like wildfire. Viewers didn't just react, they engaged. Thousands of comments flooded in from strangers who admired her composure, her intelligence, her ability to speak beyond the grave and still command a room. Journalists praised the video as a masterclass in legacy, while influencers and entrepreneurs dissected it frame by frame, quoting her words as if they were scripture. Julian didn't have to look far to see his own reputation unraveling. Headlines read like obituaries for his career. The man who forgot his wife, empire built on borrowed foundations. The widow who outsmarted the tycoon. They stung, not because they were inaccurate, but because he hadn't seen them coming. Julian avoided public places. He sent an assistant to collect his things from the office and instructed security to screen all visitors. But he couldn't avoid the consequences forever. The investors had begun to withdraw, slowly at first, then in a steady stream. Clients pulled out of major contracts, citing a desire to align with transparent leadership. A former employee had gone on record about Charlotte's influence in company development, speaking with clarity and admiration. It wasn't malicious, just honest. And that honesty was rewriting history. The world wasn't canceling Julian. It was just realizing it didn't need him. The board had initiated a vote. He would be allowed to step down quietly in the coming weeks. No scandal, no forced removal, just a graceful exit offered like a consolation prize. Thomas had called to break the news with something close to sympathy in his voice. But even he couldn't hide the inevitability of it. Julian didn't argue. He had known it was coming. There was a certain relief in the formal ending, like watching a building collapse that you'd already abandoned. In the days that followed, Julian found himself returning to old places, not the flashy venues or exclusive clubs, but the small ones, the ones Charlotte had loved. A used bookstore tucked into a quiet street near the university where she once taught part-time. The coffee shop with the crooked counter where she used to edit his presentations while sipping overly sweet lattes. The bench in Central Park where they had once sat for hours after a failed investor pitch, eating bagels and pretending they weren't scared. These places hadn't changed much, but Julian had. He walked through them like a man searching for something, not forgiveness, but understanding. He watched people closely now, trying to see what Charlotte had seen all along. The human parts, the overlooked details, the pieces of a world that didn't revolve around him. He stopped at the foundation one morning, unannounced. The staff looked surprised to see him, but no one turned him away. They welcomed him in, offered tea, and asked if he wanted a tour. He declined. He just wanted to sit in the lobby for a moment. The walls were lined with photos of smiling families, grant recipients, scholarship students, and volunteers. In one corner, a display table held a journal open to a handwritten page, a page from Charlotte's notes. It read, "The most powerful work happens when no one's watching." That's where legacy is born. He stood there for a long time. Later, as he walked back toward the street, a man stopped him. Middle-aged, dressed modestly, with a warm smile that didn't judge. "I just wanted to say thank you," the man said. "My daughter's one of the scholarship students here. We never knew Mrs. Hartley personally, but she changed our lives. You must be proud." Julian nodded slowly. "I am," he said, and for the first time in a long while, the words didn't feel hollow. At home, the penthouse grew emptier by the day. The moving company had already begun packing what little he intended to keep. The artwork was gone. The furniture had been tagged for donation or storage. He had decided to keep only a few things: a photo of Charlotte in her garden, the ring she left behind, and a small ceramic bowl she had made in a pottery class they once took together on a whim. He'd hated the class. She'd loved it. He slept on the couch now. The bed felt too big, too final. Nights stretched long and quiet. But something was shifting. Not a full redemption, not yet, but a shedding. A slow peeling away of everything he had mistaken for meaning. He no longer needed to be the center of every room. He no longer needed to win every conversation. He just wanted to feel something real, even if it hurt. He began writing, late at night, filling pages with memories. Some were sharp, others blurred, but each one felt necessary. He wrote about Charlotte's laugh, about the way she used to sing to herself when she cooked, even when the meals turned out awful. He wrote about how she always carried pens in her purse and would scribble ideas on napkins. He wrote about the time she stayed up with him through the night during a product launch, not because she had to, but because he couldn't breathe from the pressure. She hadn't said much, just sat beside him, hand on his shoulder, anchoring him with her silence. That was love. He just hadn't known it then. The last thing he wrote, before sleep finally claimed him one night, was a simple line. She wasn't the shadow. She was the architect, and I was too blind to notice the blueprint. It wasn't meant to be profound. It was just the truth. And in that moment, alone and stripped of everything he thought mattered, Julian Hartley finally began to understand that rebuilding didn't always mean reclaiming. Sometimes it meant surrendering. Sometimes it meant starting from the ruins with nothing but memory and a hope that this time, he'd learned to build something worth leaving behind. Julian never used to be afraid of lawyers. They were just part of the game, necessary assets in the pursuit of control, fluent in loopholes and clauses he used to bend the world in his favor. They protected him, buffered him, expanded his empire with the precision of craftsmen. But now, sitting in the small, glass-walled office of a probate specialist, he felt the unfamiliar weight of powerlessness. The room was sterile, the kind designed to convey quiet authority. A simple mahogany desk, a few potted plants that looked too perfectly maintained to be real, and a wall-mounted digital clock that ticked just loudly enough to be annoying. Across from him, a woman in her early 50s flipped through the stack of documents with practiced ease. Her name was Evelyn Marks, and she had been Charlotte's secondary legal counsel, brought on discreetly, independent of the firm Julian had always used. She was methodical, Evelyn said, not looking up from the papers. Didn't miss a step. Every change was executed with full clarity. Witnesses, notarizations, cross-reference signatures. You won't find anything to contest, Mr. Hartley. Julian didn't respond. He already knew. He hadn't come to fight. That instinct, the one to win, to push, to dominate, had begun to rot inside him, and he didn't have the stomach to feed it anymore. He sat in silence, absorbing the sound of rustling pages, the ticking clock, the quiet condemnation in the lawyer's tone. There are still a few outstanding matters, she continued. Some residual assets, a publishing advance from a collection of her letters and writings, and the issue of intellectual property rights on a few of the business models she registered under her name. Julian blinked. Business models? Evelyn looked up, finally meeting his eyes. Charlotte was protecting more than her finances, Mr. Hartley. She was protecting her ideas. The early pitch decks? The customer analysis projections? She filed those under her own copyright. Years ago, his mouth went dry. She never said anything. She didn't need to, Evelyn replied. She wasn't trying to cash in. She was building insurance. Not just for herself, but for the story she wanted told. Julian shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The world was unraveling again in layers he hadn't even considered. He had always thought of Charlotte's contributions as background texture. Valuable, yes, but ultimately secondary. He never imagined she had moved quietly through the architecture of the business, laying claim to ideas while letting him present them as his own. But she had, and now those claims were being recognized, protected, and worst of all, credited. She also filed a digital library, Evelyn added, pulling out a tablet. Recordings, emails, notes from strategic meetings, all backed up to an encrypted cloud server. It's already been handed over to the foundation. Julian closed his eyes for a moment. He could feel the ground shifting beneath him again. Each revelation was like a floorboard snapping underfoot. The story he had told about himself, crafted so carefully over the years, was being peeled apart by the truth Charlotte had left behind. Not out of vengeance, but out of necessity. What happens to the rest? He asked quietly. Evelyn set the papers down. You retain partial ownership of the brand, but the controlling interest now sits with the board. As per Charlotte's request, they have voting authority to redirect the brand's mission if it no longer reflects the values she outlined in her final strategic brief. He let out a breath, slow and heavy. So, it's not mine anymore. She didn't sugarcoat it. Not in the way you're used to. The meeting ended without fanfare. Evelyn offered a firm handshake and a folder of finalized documents, then returned to her paperwork without another glance. Julian walked out of the office into a crisp afternoon, the wind slicing through his coat, as if the city itself was reminding him of how small he'd become. Outside, everything looked the same. Buses groaning past, pedestrians moving in clumps, the distant wail of a siren, but it all felt different. Like he'd stepped into a parallel version of his life, where nothing he built was really his. Back at the penthouse, the packing had resumed. The hallway echoed with cardboard boxes being taped, furniture being disassembled. Movers worked efficiently, not asking questions. Julian stood in the doorway of his study and watched as one of them wrapped the last of his framed awards. It looked ridiculous now, an oversized plaque declaring him Visionary of the Year. He almost told them to leave it behind. Instead, he turned away and walked to the balcony. The skyline stretched before him, glass and steel glittering under the weight of dusk. This had been his view for years. He used to believe it was the pinnacle of achievement. Now it felt like a wall, a barrier between who he was and who he might have been. He remembered how Charlotte used to stand there too, arms crossed, watching the horizon with a kind of quiet defiance. Not because she loved the view, but because she understood what it meant to dream beyond it. He sat down on one of the patio chairs, the cold seeping through his suit pants, and pulled Charlotte's letter from his pocket. He'd read it so many times now he knew it by heart, but he kept it with him like a compass. She had known this would happen, had counted on it, not out of cruelty, but because she wanted him to see, really see, what she had always seen. He stayed there until night fell and the city turned to shadow and light. And when the last mover closed the door behind them, the echo of Charlotte's absence filled the space like a fog. He was no longer the man who walked into rooms and drew all eyes. He was just a man, stripped of armor, watching the world go on without him. The next morning, he visited her grave. It was quiet at the cemetery, the grass still damp from overnight rain. The headstone was simple, her name, her birth and death dates, and a line etched beneath. She lived fully, loved quietly, and built something that outlasted time. Julian stood there for a long while, hands in his coat pockets, unsure of what he had come to say. Apologies felt empty. Regret didn't cover the depth of what he carried now. But still, he spoke. "You did it," he said, voice low. "You outthought me. Outlived me, in a way. I see it now." He paused. "I don't know what comes next, but I'll try to build it different. I won't pretend it makes up for everything, but I'll try." There was no answer, no breeze, no shift in the sky. But for the first time in weeks, the silence felt less like punishment and more like possibility. A space where something new could begin. Not an empire, not a brand, just a life. One without applause, one without performance, one where he could finally stop trying to be the story and start listening to the ones he had missed. And maybe, in that quiet, he could find a way to carry her forward, not as a ghost or a wound, but as the architect she had always been. There had been a time when Julian Hartley's name alone could shift the mood of a room. One glance, one phone call, one comment in passing was enough to open doors and close deals. His presence was once synonymous with confidence, precision, dominance. But now, as he walked into a restaurant he used to frequent with investors and foreign dignitaries, no one turned their head. The maitre d' gave him a perfunctory nod, barely disguising the fact that he didn't remember who Julian was. The corner table, the one always reserved under his name, was occupied by a younger executive, laughing into a cocktail glass while waving toward a woman half his age. Julian asked for a table near the window and was offered one by the kitchen instead. He didn't argue. The silence was becoming something he wore, like an old jacket, uncomfortable but familiar. And this silence wasn't just personal anymore. It had infiltrated every aspect of his legacy. Clients had begun pulling their accounts, not with animosity, but with indifference. "We're exploring new partnerships," was the phrasing most of them used, but the subtext was clear. Your story no longer holds value. The board's tone had changed as well, once full of strategic optimism, now dry and mechanical. His resignation had been drafted and would soon be announced in a carefully managed press release. They would frame it as a transition. He would be pursuing new ventures. The truth would not be part of the narrative. But that didn't matter anymore, because Charlotte's truth had already rewritten the one he spent decades curating. The morning papers weren't kind. Julian no longer read the headlines, but he couldn't avoid the articles that landed on his desk. An expose by a former employee detailed how Charlotte had been instrumental in the company's growth, offering insight that steered the business through its earliest challenges. Another article recounted how she had anonymously sponsored dozens of female entrepreneurs, many of whom were now speaking up to honor her memory. Her influence wasn't just being acknowledged, it was being celebrated. And in that celebration, Julian's shadow stretched thinner by the day. Then came the interview. Delilah. She had been quiet since the funeral, but not absent. Julian hadn't tried to contact her after she left the penthouse, assuming she had disappeared like so many others once the wealth dried up. But there she was, center stage on a primetime talk show, seated across from a host with a reputation for digging into scandal. Her appearance was striking, polished, composed, but something in her demeanor had changed. She no longer looked like a trophy. She looked like someone telling her side of the story for the first time. "I was never told the truth," she said, her voice clear, rehearsed but sincere. Not by Julian. Not by anyone. Charlotte didn't just fund his empire. She shaped it. "I thought I was stepping into a life of success, but I was stepping into someone else's shadow." The audience was silent as she continued. She wasn't bitter. She wasn't weak. She was watching. And when the time came, she made sure the world saw what he tried so hard to keep hidden. Julian watched the clip from his office. He didn't feel betrayed. Not really. He felt hollow. Delilah had once been his escape, a reflection of vitality, youth, possibility. But now, even she had turned into a mirror, forcing him to look at himself with brutal honesty. And for the first time, he didn't look away. Later that week, his financial advisor called. "I've reviewed your accounts," she said gently, almost apologetically. "And while you're still comfortable, your liquidity is limited. The assets tied to the trust are no longer accessible. The properties have either been transferred or scheduled for sale. And without the board's endorsement, your speaking engagements and brand deals have all been paused." He already knew, of course. He wasn't stupid. But hearing it said aloud felt like the last nail in a very elaborate coffin. The empire hadn't collapsed in flames. It had simply dried up. Bit by bit, choice by choice, Charlotte had rerouted every stream of power until what remained was a hollow name attached to an empty tower. He walked into his office, what used to be his office, for the last time the following Monday. The nameplate had already been removed from the door. Inside, boxes waited for him, neatly packed. A young executive, probably fresh from an Ivy League MBA program, greeted him with forced politeness and offered to help him carry his things. Julian declined. He moved slowly through the space, tracing his fingers along the desk, remembering the weight of contracts, the rush of winning, the satisfaction of having his voice heard across continents. It had all meant something once. Now it felt distant, like a story someone else had told him long ago. On his way out, he passed the company's mission statement etched into the lobby wall. It had changed. A new inscription stood beneath the original motto. One of Charlotte's quotes, now immortalized in gold. "Real power doesn't need to be seen to be felt." He paused for a long moment, reading those words over and over. They were simple, unassuming, but they carried more force than any slogan he had ever written. And they reminded him that while he had always focused on being recognized, Charlotte had focused on being remembered. He left the building without speaking to anyone. No one stopped him. No one tried to hold him back. And as the elevator doors closed, he saw his reflection once again. Still in a tailored suit. Still tall, proud. But behind his eyes, something had cracked. Not broken. Cracked. And through that crack, something softer was beginning to emerge. At home, the penthouse was almost bare. Just a few more days before the keys would be handed over. He sat at the kitchen island, flipping through a worn notebook he found among Charlotte's things. It was filled with ideas, sketches, plans she'd made for the foundation, many of which had already been implemented. But at the very back, there was a single page, folded in half. He opened it. "I never wanted to erase you, Julian. Just to remind you that you weren't alone in building what we built. And if you ever choose to build again, build with someone, not on top of them." He closed the notebook and placed it in the only box he planned to carry out himself. And for the first time since the funeral, he allowed himself a thought that didn't hurt. Not redemption, not revenge, but maybe, just maybe a beginning. One that didn't require applause. It had been 3 days since Julian Hartley left his office for the last time. 3 days since the security badge clipped to his lapel had become just another relic tossed into a drawer. The penthouse now echoed with absence, stripped of its furniture and adorned only by scattered boxes, each one filled with a different kind of silence. He hadn't yet decided where to go, not really. The townhouse on the east side had already been claimed by the trust. His vacation properties were being repurposed. The luxury hotels he once used as escape routes now felt cold, transactional. They didn't want him anymore. They wanted the version of him that had power. And that version was gone. So he stayed, at least for a little longer, in a space that no longer belonged to him, among the fading shadows of a life he no longer recognized. It was strange how familiar everything looked in the soft morning light, and yet how entirely foreign it felt. The view from the window hadn't changed. The city still stretched endlessly beneath him, pulsing with life, but Julian knew it wasn't his anymore. He had once thought the skyline mirrored his ambition. Now, it just reminded him of everything he hadn't seen until it was too late. He poured coffee into a chipped mug he hadn't realized they still owned. It had been Charlotte's favorite. A cheap ceramic thing with a faded quote printed on the side. Legacy is not what you leave behind, but who you leave it with. He remembered how she'd smiled the first time she read it, standing barefoot in the kitchen, sunlight tangled in her hair. He hadn't thought much of it at the time. Another one of her poetic whims. But now it felt like a truth she'd embedded into every part of their life, quietly, patiently, without asking for recognition. He sipped from the cup and let the bitterness settle on his tongue. The news had moved on. The story of Charlotte's posthumous video had reached its peak and was now dissolving into retrospectives and think pieces. But Julian's world hadn't moved with it. He received fewer calls now, mostly from people who didn't yet know he was no longer the man they expected. There were still a few invitations, lectures, interviews, half-hearted proposals for ghostwriting his version of events, but he declined them all. What could he possibly say that wouldn't sound like an excuse? On the third morning, he decided to walk. He left the penthouse in a simple black coat. No entourage, no car service. Just him and the city. He wandered without direction, eventually finding himself outside the conservatory where Charlotte's donated piano had been placed. The building was old, red brick with arched windows and ivy climbing up the walls. He hadn't visited it in years. Not since the gala they'd attended when the school had honored her for her volunteer work. He hadn't stayed long that night. There had been a business dinner across town. He remembered kissing her cheek and whispering, "I'll be back in an hour." He hadn't returned until the next morning. Inside, the conservatory was quiet. A young student guided him to the performance hall, unaware of who he was. There, beneath soft stage lights, sat the grand piano. Charlotte's piano. It gleamed with fresh polish, untouched but revered. A small plaque sat on the wall nearby, in memory of Charlotte Whitmore Hartley. She believed in second chances. He sat in the back row and watched as a girl no older than 17 took the bench and began to play. It wasn't perfect. The notes stumbled at first, but then they settled into a melody Charlotte had once played in the early days of their marriage, back when the apartment was small and the dreams even smaller. He had almost forgotten how it went. Hearing it again felt like stepping into a memory too fragile to touch. His eyes burned, but he didn't blink. He let the sound carry him somewhere quieter than grief. When the girl finished, she looked toward the back of the room and gave him a polite nod. He returned it and left without a word. As he stepped back into the cold, he caught a glimpse of his reflection in the building's glass doors. For a moment, he didn't recognize the man staring back. The lines on his face had deepened. His eyes looked softer, heavier, not with fatigue, but with something deeper. The suit fit the same, but he no longer wore it like armor. He looked like someone who had finally been forced to see himself, fully, painfully, honestly. That night, he began packing the last of the boxes himself. He moved slowly, stopping often to examine forgotten items. A photograph of Charlotte at the beach, hair blowing in the wind. A letter she had written but never sent, tucked into a drawer alongside receipts from the first office they ever rented. A silver cufflink she had given him before his first major speaking engagement. He collected them all, not to preserve the past, but to understand it. Around midnight, he pulled out a framed mirror that had hung above the fireplace. It was ornate, heavy, the kind Charlotte had insisted on keeping even when it didn't match the decor. "It has soul," she'd said, and he had rolled his eyes. Now, standing in front of it alone, he finally saw what she meant. His reflection was still there, but behind it, there was more. There was the outline of her, a presence that hadn't faded. Not a ghost, but a memory carved into the edges of everything she touched. She had seen through him, around him, beyond him, and now he was beginning to see her too. He carried the mirror to the foyer, where it would be picked up with the rest of the donations. But before he let it go, he stared into it one more time. Not to adjust his tie, not to check his posture, just to acknowledge the man looking back. "I'm not done," he whispered, "but I'll do it differently now." And for once, he meant it. The next morning, he left the keys on the marble kitchen counter, took the final box in his arms, and walked out of the penthouse without looking back. He didn't need to. The past would follow him wherever he went. But this time, it wouldn't be a burden. It would be a blueprint. Delilah hadn't planned to stay in the city after the funeral. At least, not at first. Her suitcase had remained half-packed in the corner of a downtown hotel room for days. Untouched except for the scattered items she kept fishing out to survive the next hour. Makeup remover, her favorite scarf, the tiny notebook she always carried but never wrote in. She told herself she'd leave after the dust settled, after the headlines faded, after she could walk into a cafe without overhearing Charlotte's name spoken in hushed reverence. But each day, she remained. Not because she was waiting for Julian. She wasn't, but because she needed to feel something real. Something that wasn't built on performance, seduction, or survival. In the beginning, Delilah had believed in the illusion. She had believed in Julian's stories, in the way he talked about Charlotte like she was a tired relic of a failed marriage. He had told her they were finished long before Delilah came into the picture. He had painted himself as misunderstood, trapped, loyal only out of guilt. And Delilah, barely into her 30s and starved for validation, had clung to every word. She hadn't known about the will, the recordings, the foundation, the plans Charlotte had made in silence. She hadn't known that she'd walked into someone else's story, someone else's home, someone else's fight. And by the time she realized it, it was already too late. The funeral had cracked her open. Not the ceremony itself, but the moment Charlotte's voice filled the chapel. That calm, steady voice. That elegance sharpened with steel. Delilah had never met her, not really. Their paths had crossed briefly, awkwardly, but the woman she heard in that video was not what Julian had described. She wasn't bitter or cold. She was composed, aware, unapologetically in control. Delilah had sat there frozen, her fingers clenched around her handbag, and realized the truth she'd been avoiding for months. She had been a placeholder, a distraction, a temporary thrill for a man who had never really let go of the woman he thought he had outgrown. After the service, Delilah had walked out without a word. She hadn't packed her things from the penthouse. She hadn't waited for Julian to chase her, because she finally understood he wouldn't. Not because he didn't care, but because he didn't know how. Julian loved in theory. He admired. He collected. But he didn't see people unless they were holding something he needed. And now that everything had shifted, now that his power had collapsed in on itself, there was nothing left to hold him up. Or her. She moved into a studio apartment across the river. Small, unremarkable, but hers. No housekeepers. No imported rugs. No pressure to look like a trophy every morning. The first week was the hardest. The silence was sharp, unfamiliar. She didn't know what to do with the absence of praise. She didn't know how to define herself without the echoes of Julian's compliments or Charlotte's implied judgment. But slowly, that silence began to soften. It became space. Delilah found work at a local art gallery, not as a curator, but at the front desk. She greeted guests, answered phones, served wine during exhibits. It was humbling, and at first she hated it. But one afternoon, an older woman approached her and said, "I like how you see people. You don't just look through them." And Delilah had smiled, not out of politeness, but because, for once, she had been seen for something that wasn't about how she looked. She kept her distance from Julian. There were moments when curiosity tugged at her, late nights when she hovered over her phone, thumb drifting toward his name in her contacts. But she never called. She didn't need to. The press did a good job keeping her informed. The empire was unraveling, but not dramatically. It was dissolving with dignity, like a company quietly being absorbed by a bigger one. She wondered if he ever thought about her, if he regretted not asking what she wanted, or who she was before she became someone else's second act. Then, one afternoon, a letter arrived. No return address, just her name in familiar handwriting on the envelope. She opened it slowly, fingers trembling before she even read the first line. It was from Charlotte, written months ago, sealed and delivered through the estate executor. The letter was short, no longer than a page. "Delilah," it began, "I'm sure this isn't the way you expected to hear from me. I don't know what version of me you've been shown, but I want you to hear from me directly." Delilah sat down on the edge of her bed, eyes fixed on the page. "I don't hate you. I know you might have expected that, but I don't. I pity you, in the way I once pitied myself, for accepting less than we deserve, for mistaking attention for affection, for letting someone else define our worth." Tears welled in her eyes, but she kept reading. "You stepped into a life that was collapsing, and I don't blame you for wanting more. But understand this, you are not a villain in my story, nor am I in yours. We were both caught in the orbit of a man who only ever saw reflections of himself. Now you are free. Don't waste that freedom trying to reclaim something that was never truly yours. Build something new. Build it for you." The letter ended with one final line. "Leave the mirror behind. Find the window." Delilah folded the letter carefully, placed it in the drawer beside her bed, and stared at the wall for a long time. She didn't feel absolved, but she felt something clearer, a quiet nudge toward truth. The next morning, she walked to the gallery early and sat at the front desk as the sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows. She thought of the letter, of Charlotte, of the piano she'd once seen in the penthouse, sitting untouched in a room filled with silence. And for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel like she was waiting for anything. She wasn't Julian's next chapter. She wasn't Charlotte's rival. She was her own beginning. And this time, she would write the story herself, without needing to be anyone else's plot twist, without chasing a spotlight that burned too hot. Just a woman with a second chance, and all the time in the world to make it mean something. The day Julian Hartley left the penthouse for good was gray, not stormy, not dramatic, just quietly overcast in a way that suited the ending. He handed the keys to a young woman from the foundation, someone polite and efficient who smiled, but didn't ask for a photo or handshake. She walked through the space with a checklist, making notes as movers carried the last few boxes out. He watched them without speaking. There was nothing left to argue for, nothing to hold on to. The space was no longer his. It hadn't been for a while. He stood in the doorway for a moment longer than necessary, then stepped into the hallway and didn't look back. Some people make dramatic exits. Julian simply closed the door and moved forward. He walked to the nearest subway station. He hadn't taken the subway in years, not since before the success, before the boardrooms and limousines and private elevators. He didn't wear sunglasses to hide his face. He didn't rush to avoid recognition. The truth was, no one really looked at him. He was just another face in the crowd now, and that anonymity felt strangely merciful. The train was crowded and slow, full of commuters scrolling through their phones, lost in their own quiet battles. He found a seat by the window and stared at his reflection as the city blurred past. Lines around his eyes, a jaw that once seemed carved now softened by weight he'd never noticed until he had to carry it alone. He was headed to a small law office in Queens, not for damage control or negotiation, but to finalize something Charlotte had initiated and never lived to complete. The disbursement of personal letters and keepsakes she had prepared for friends, colleagues, even a few strangers whose lives she'd touched along the way. Langford had called him 2 weeks earlier to ask if he'd like to be the one to deliver the final envelope. Just one, just for him. Julian had hesitated, then agreed. The office was modest, white walls, creaky floors, old radiators that hissed when the heat kicked on. Langford greeted him with his usual calm. He looked thinner than Julian remembered, older, as if even he had been caught in the storm Charlotte left behind. "She wrote this shortly before the hospital," Langford said, handing over the sealed envelope. "Said it wasn't a goodbye. Said it was a reminder." Julian nodded and left without reading it there. He didn't want witnesses. He didn't want the safety net of a neutral setting. He needed to read her final words somewhere still raw. He took a cab to Riverside Park, to the bench where they'd once sat and planned their lives. It hadn't changed. Trees stretched overhead, their branches bare, the wind rolling in gentle gusts that carried the scent of the river. He sat down slowly, knees stiff, fingers tightening around the envelope. He broke the seal. The letter inside was written in her handwriting. Neat, slanted, purposeful. No date, no salutation. Just her voice, unmistakable in its quiet strength. You used to say I was too calm in chaos, it began. That when everything fell apart, I'd just sit still like I was waiting for the pieces to land. You were right, but you never asked why. Julian's throat tightened. I sat still because I wanted to see who you would become when the dust cleared. I knew you'd survive. You always do. But surviving isn't the same as becoming. That takes something else. Something harder. He blinked, trying to steady the page. You built your life like a monument, stone stacked on stone, always higher, always louder. But monuments don't move. They just stand there, untouched, unchanged, admired. I didn't want to be a statue beside you. I wanted a life. The bench creaked under his weight as he leaned forward, elbows on knees, eyes locked on the ink. I didn't leave you because I stopped loving you. I left because I started loving myself enough to stop disappearing. That was the difference. You never noticed how quiet I became. You mistook silence for agreement, endurance for devotion. He closed his eyes, her words cutting deeper with every line. But the silence was never empty. It was waiting for this. There was a pause in the writing, a small space between paragraphs, as if she had stepped away and returned with clarity. I know you feel lost right now. I know the applause has stopped and the lights have gone out. But that doesn't mean the story ends here. It just means you have to learn how to speak without a microphone, how to lead without a crown. I built something with you. Not for you. With you. And now I leave you with one final truth. He held his breath. Now let's see what you do without me. No signature. No closing line. Just those words. Julian sat for a long time, the letter trembling in his hands. Around him, the park moved on. Children chasing pigeons, joggers passing by. The world unbothered by the unraveling of one man's history. And for the first time in months, Julian felt something shift inside him. Not clarity, not resolution, just movement. As if he were no longer frozen in the story of who he had been, but being pushed, however gently, toward who he might become. He folded the letter and placed it in his coat pocket, close to his chest. He didn't know what came next. There was no empire to rebuild, no audience to win back, no script to follow. But there was breath in his lungs, and silence that finally sounded like freedom. And maybe that was enough.